Welcome to the Integrated Deterrence video series, presented by the Air Force Culture and Language Center. This video is a brief history of terrorism and is broken into 7 chapters. After a brief introduction, we provide a discussion of relevant terminology. Next, we look at enabling factors of modern terrorism, followed by an overview of the analytical framework of David C. Rapoport's 4 waves of terrorism. Finally, we'll wrap up with a discussion on the future of terrorism. Chapter 1: Introduction. Terrorism and the violent extremist organizations, or VEOs, that sometimes commit terrorist acts are major concerns for both domestic and international security. Terrorists and VEOs exist in nearly every country in the world, leveraging a wide range of political views, tactics, and strategies to advance their goals. The majority of VEOs are short-lived, lasting less than 10 years. Most end by either joining legitimate political processes or being dismantled by law enforcement organizations. While violent extremists have existed throughout history, the VEO in its modern form can be traced back to the mid-19th century, when industrialization led to ideological and social changes in politics, the development of mass communication, and the industrial production of weapons, creating an environment in which violence could reinforce political speech. While early terrorists and VEOs focused on assassinations and bombings, movements and tactics have evolved, along with ideological shifts and technology, to expand into kidnappings, hijackings, and mass murders. Chapter 2: Defining terms. There is no universally accepted definition of terrorism. Scholars and policymakers lack commonly agreed-upon distinctions between terrorism and insurrection on the one hand, and between terrorism and basic crime on the other. Similarly, there is no precise definition of violent extremism. However, terrorism is generally understood to be a subset of violent extremism. Terminology has also changed over time. For example, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, terrorists were broadly referred to as anarchists regardless of the perpetrator's ideology. Within the Department of Defense, or DoD, terrorism is defined as the unlawful use of violence or threat of violence, often motivated by religious, political, or other ideological beliefs, to instill fear and coerce individuals, governments, or societies in pursuit of terrorist goals. This definition includes many generally accepted elements that define terrorism, including the use of violence, political motivation, and intended response from governments and citizenry. It's important to note that political violence exists on a spectrum between organized and planned interstate warfare on one end and spontaneous unorganized destruction and riots, often from protests turned violent on the other end. Terrorism is generally committed by non-state actors, relies on individuals or small groups, and is typically premeditated, separating it from both interstate warfare and spontaneous violence. While some ideologies incorporate political violence as an integral part of strategy and doctrine, others resort to violent acts only when other pathways or legal means to achieving their aims are closed or seen as futile. In Benito Mussolini's fascism and Mao Zedong's communism, violence played an important role in developing political consciousness. For other groups, violence and terrorism are tactical responses to an asymmetrical power structure. An adage says that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. This has often been applied to separatist and anti-colonial fighters. The term freedom fighter arose in the early 20th century with the rise of decolonization movements, including the Viet Minh. The interpretation of terrorist versus freedom fighter is a matter of perspective, with those opposed to action seeing the perpetrator as a terrorist, while those in support view them as a freedom fighter. Labeling an act of violence as terrorist characterizes it as both illegal and illegitimate, One key trait of terrorist attacks is asymmetry against the state. While governments typically fight through conventional means, violent extremists are limited to asymmetric warfare. The goals of their attacks aren't to directly overthrow the government, but to raise awareness of their cause and discredit the state's ability to provide security. To understand what constitutes an act of terror, it is important to differentiate between the victims of a terrorist attack and the intended audience. Acts of terrorism are a form of political communication designed to provoke strong emotions like anger and fear, while victims may constitute a part of the intended audience. The political message is targeted towards a much broader audience. Terrorist attacks have a performative aspect designed to create fear within an adversarial population, raise awareness within neutral distant audiences, and inspire action or support from potential sympathizers. Terrorist activities also raise the risks associated with continuing existing policies or practices, potentially upsetting a government's cost-benefit analysis. They can also force a government to institute unpopular restrictive measures to counter terrorism. Because of the many parties that can be audiences, violent extremists must carefully consider how to plan attacks to reach their intended audience. Tactics, techniques, and procedures are not ideology-specific. Methods popular for one successful terrorist will often be adopted by others seeking to emulate their success, even if they're competitors. One major example is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, drawing tactical lessons from the Irgun, a Zionist terrorist group whose political goals directly opposed the PLO's. Another example is Timothy McVeigh, who committed the Oklahoma City bombing. While his ideology came from the Christian identity movement, he studied bomb-making with radical Islamist groups in the Philippines. Motivations for terrorism have varied over time. The European International Police, or Europol, has defined 5 major ideological categories of violent extremism. These categories are: 1. Religiously motivated, whose ideology is based on religious extremism, like Al-Qaeda. 2. Ethno-nationalist and separatist, whose goals are nationalist in nature and often campaign for independence, like the Irish Republican Army. 3. Left-wing and anarchist, which typically fights for leftist ideologies, including Marxism, like the Weather Underground. 4. Right-wing, who campaign for extremist right-wing ideologies, such as the Contras in Nicaragua. And 5. Single issue, who focus on one topic, for example, anti-abortion or eco-terrorism. Many VEOs fall into multiple categories. For example, following World War II, the Viet Minh combined ethno-nationalist and left-wing goals to campaign both for Vietnamese independence and the establishment of a communist state. Another example is the Unión Guerrera Blanca that was active in El Salvador in the 1970s and 1980s and espoused a Falangist ideology, combining right-wing and religious motivations, specifically a combination of fascism and Catholicism. Contemporary terrorists are also categorized as foreign, homegrown, or domestic. While foreign terrorist organizations may target the United States or other Western powers, they are located in other countries and their activities cross international borders. Homegrown terrorists are citizens who act on behalf of foreign organizations. They may become foreign fighters who join terrorist cells abroad, or they may commit acts of terrorism in their own country on behalf of the foreign terror organization. Domestic terrorists operate within their own country and are motivated by causes closer to home. The designations of foreign, homegrown, or domestic are important for legal and investigative purposes. Despite these distinctions, domestic violent extremists are increasingly developing transnational ties to other extremist groups. Terrorists can also be classified by organizational structure and size. Groups like ISIS or the Ku Klux Klan have larger numbers and are formally organized. Small cells consist of a handful of individuals who may follow a charismatic leader but are less formally structured. Terrorists also include lone actors, sometimes called lone wolves, who operate independently from violent extremist organizations. Scholars note differences in the motivations, operations, and dynamics of group, small cell, and lone actor terrorists. These differences are important considerations when considering steps to prevent or counter terrorist activity. Chapter 3: Historical Analysis: Enabling Factors. Political violence has existed for as long as politics has existed. Records of pre-modern VEOs date as far back as the Classical era. The Sicarii is a Jewish nationalist group that opposed the Roman occupation of Judea in the 1st century AD and engaged in a decades-long campaign of public assassinations. From the 11th to the 13th centuries AD, the Nizari Ismailis, an isolationist Shia radical group active in modern-day Syria and Iran, carried out an assassination campaign against their perceived enemies. These are just two examples. This video focuses on modern terrorism, looking at the last 2 centuries of violent extremism. Scholars of modern terrorism examine 3 key elements of each terrorist attack: motivation, means, and opportunity. In the 18th and 19th centuries, social and cultural changes in Europe lay the foundations that would characterize modern terrorism, beginning first in Europe and then spreading to other parts of the globe. The era saw the development of political ideologies, mass communications tools, and the mass production of weapons. These developments shaped both the motivations and means for terrorist activity. Motivation. Intellectual movements like the Enlightenment, combined with the economic and social changes of industrialization, led to new attitudes about the individual's role in politics and governance. The French Revolution of 1789 demonstrated the potential for radical change and encouraged the growth of political ideologies. The revolution marked the expansion of politics away from the domain of social elites around the world. Urbanization and the growth of manufacturing created a new class of industrial workers, expanding the middle class. A larger middle class also meant a larger number of educated individuals with their own political interests. The ideology of nationalism motivated many early incidents of modern political violence. Nationalist movements across Europe engaged in political violence during the revolutions of 1848. In 1853, nationalist Karl Heinz coined the term freedom fighter, and in his pamphlet, Mord und Freiheit, promoted the use of violence to effect political change. Other ideologies motivating modern terrorist activity will be discussed later in this video. The modern era has also seen the growth of mass communications. The 19th century brought the expansion of newspapers and printed media, then telegraph and railway networks, and finally radio. The 20th century broadened radio and telephone and introduced the television. Today, satellite communications and the internet allow instant global contact. Improvements in transportation, from shipbuilding and railroads to contemporary air travel, make travel cheaper and faster, allowing extremists to build transnational networks. All these technologies allowed for the faster spread of ideas and people, leading to a growth in transnational terrorism and the spread of radical and extremist ideologies. Modern violent extremists have adapted and utilized each of these new technologies. Advances in communication and transportation allowed violent extremists to promote their causes to sympathetic audiences abroad. Early examples are seen in the funding of Irish nationalist terrorists by Irish immigrants living in the United States and Russian revolutionary groups founded by exiles living in Switzerland and the United Kingdom. The Islamic State and Al-Qaeda offer more recent examples. Improvements in transportation over the period expanded opportunities for transnational organizational networks. Means. The modern era also saw technological advances in weaponry, and dual-use technologies allowed for deadly and concealable arms to be used outside of the military. One of the most important events was the development of industrial explosives. Nitroglycerin was invented in 1847 and later stabilized as dynamite in 1867. Stable and mass-produced explosives were used in early terrorist attacks, including a grenade known as the Orsini bomb, used in an assassination attempt against Napoleon III in 1858. The century also saw the first use of a time bomb in 1864. In an attack on Ulysses S. Grant's headquarters that killed more than 50 people. In addition to explosives, firearms became cheaper, broadly available, and more effective with the use of standardized parts. The revolver was invented in 1835 and the repeater rifle in 1860. VEOs and terrorism occurred throughout the industrialized world, with several examples local to U.S. history. One of the first major terrorist attacks was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. The attack was based on left-wing abolitionist and religious extremist ideology. Its goal was to seize a U.S. military armory and disperse the weapons to slaves and instigate a slave revolt. The attack was an act of insurrection, but was also an act of terrorism because of its intent to frighten its audience of Southern slaveholders. This drew from the mass production of arms, the ability to transport materiel to strategic locations, and a revolutionary ideology. The attack ultimately failed in its goal, but accelerated the political polarization in the lead-up to the Civil War. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the United States also experienced the rise of organized white supremacist terrorists, most notably the Ku Klux Klan. Their ideology was ethno-nationalist in nature, opposing civil liberties for African Americans, but also included significant religious influence from racist interpretations of Christianity. They engaged in a campaign of murder and intimidation to suppress African American representation in elections, civil society, and business. They recruited from white Americans who were typically part of the middle class or higher. Their influence waned after federal action against the organization in 1871, although many of their members would become politically influential following Reconstruction. Chapter 4. Analytical Framework. Rapoport's 4 Waves of Terrorism. Political scientist David C. Rapoport provides a framework for analyzing the history of terrorism from the 1880s onward. He breaks the history of terrorism into 4 waves, based on common ideologies, strategies, and tactics employed. These 4 waves are: 1. Anarchists, active from the 1880s to 1920. 2. Anti-colonialists, active from the 1920s to 1960s. 3. The New Left, active from the 1960s to 1970s. And 4. The Religious Wave, active from 1979 to the present. Waves die out as organizations dissipate and inheritors to revolutionary ideals become less committed to the ideology than their founders were. Additionally, the context surrounding many political movements change, or activists may determine other legal means are more effective. For instance, many of the early 20th century anti-colonial movements that won independence no longer have the goal of gaining independence from a colonial master to organize around. When working with the Waves of Terrorism model, it's important to remember that it's a framework for understanding terrorism and not a comprehensive history. There are terrorists reflecting each identified type of terrorism at every point throughout recent history, and a variety of strategies and tactics are employed. First wave, anarchists. The defining trait for the anarchist wave of terrorists over the organizations of previous decades was the development of doctrines of political violence. Prior models of spreading revolutionary fervor, like distributing pamphlets and leaflets, were deemed insufficient to inspire the mass mobilization needed for revolution. More extreme actions were deemed necessary to broaden political movements beyond the intelligentsia. Early theories on terrorism as a political act came from Russian revolutionaries, who saw acts of terrorism as a form of communication. The anarchist Peter Kropotkin referred to terrorist acts as propaganda by the deed. The concept is that extremists would be more able to gain followers and promote their cause through coverage in the mass media, rather than through the distribution of revolutionary literature. As such, it's essentially a method of co-opting the media to broadcast the extremists' own aims. To these anarchists and terrorists, terrorism is a means to achieve a goal, not an end itself. As explained earlier in this video, the immediate target of the act of terror is not the actual audience. The point of an attack is to stir an audience to action. Tactically, the Russian revolutionaries believed sustained campaigns of terrorism were needed to drive polarization. Additionally, selected targets needed to be political in nature to broadcast their inherently political message. One secondary goal of the Russian anarchists was to use the courtroom as a public stage from which to argue their cause. An example of this is the trial of Vera Zasulich in 1878. Zasulich had attacked a police officer who had abused political prisoners. She was able to make her trial about the excesses of police violence rather than her crime, and was ultimately acquitted. Revolutionaries throughout Russia, who saw the reformist regime of Tsar Alexander II as lacking in its reforms to improve Russia's government and welfare state, embarked on a wave of assassinations beginning in the late 1870s. In 1881, the radical group Narodnaya Volya assassinated Alexander II. The attack ultimately proved counterproductive, as Narodnaya Volya was shut down by authorities and Alexander's successor repealed many of the reforms that revolutionaries had campaigned for. However, the attack was successful in inspiring revolutionary activities in Russia. The Russian rebels exported their tactics, teaching Armenian and Polish national groups their strategies. Others fled to Russian émigré communities in Switzerland, organized attacks from Finland, or secured financing for extremists from Japan, laundering the money through American banks. This marked the earliest form of transnational extremism, which grew during this era. By the 1890s, violent extremist organizations existed throughout the Western world. The most prevalent form of attack was assassinations, with the heads of state of France, Spain, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and the United States assassinated in the span of less than a decade. Most countries responded by expanding police forces, criminalizing terrorists, and restricting immigration. Fear of anarchism led to initial attempts at international law enforcement cooperation, with Interpol founded in 1914 to combat VEOs. The first wave ended with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria by Yugoslav nationalists, instigating World War I. The war caused by the assassination discredited anarchist groups and led to the effective end of the anarchist-labeled political movements. Second wave, anti-colonialists. The subsequent wave of terrorism was the anti-colonial wave. Many movements held an ideological connection to the concept of self-determination, the idea that a nation should be able to determine its own form of government. While self-determination was enshrined in international law with the Treaty of Versailles, it was often ignored. Anti-colonial VEOs were also influenced by the arrival of the United States as a major world power and its anti-imperialist foreign policy. The longest and most entrenched terrorist campaigns of this wave happened in locations where colonial withdrawals were unappealing for their rulers, often due to issues of minority rights. Notable examples of this include Ireland, where the Protestant-majority Northern Ireland favored remaining part of the United Kingdom rather than joining a Catholic-dominated independent Ireland. Algeria, where the ethnic French minority wished to maintain French rule. Palestine, where Jewish and Palestinian groups competed for influence in the foreseen power vacuum that would be associated with the United Kingdom's pending exit. And Cyprus, where the minority Turkish population resisted potential Greek rule, and where the colonial ruler, the United Kingdom, wished to retain the island as a base for military actions in the Middle East. Strategy and tactics of the anti-colonial wave changed significantly from the earlier anarchists. Most of the movements were ethno-nationalist in nature. Global immigration led to extremists securing financing through diaspora groups rather than criminal activity, as was practiced by earlier groups. Examples of this include Irish and Jewish diaspora groups in the United States funding terrorists abroad. The Front de Libération Nationale, or FLN, which agitated for Algerian independence from France, secured considerable political and logistical support from Arab states. Anti-colonial extremist groups also rejected the term terrorist, preferring freedom fighter as a means of legitimizing their struggles. Terrorists of this era generally avoided assassinations, which they found to be counterproductive. Instead, tactics emphasized targeting security forces, first attacking the police and then attacking the military forces brought in to replace the police. Targeting military forces was considered vital in provoking an overreaction from authorities, which could drive support for the terrorists. One of the representative terrorist attacks of this wave was the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem by the Zionist VEO, Irgun. The building was targeted because it was the headquarters for the United Kingdom's colonial administration. The bombing had a high death toll, which we can support in the United Kingdom for continued presence in Palestine. It also instigated major fissures between Zionist groups, with many mainstream groups condemning Irgun's tactics. However, following Israel's independence, one of the perpetrators of the attack, Menachem Begin, was elected Prime Minister of Israel. Of the ongoing terrorist campaigns mentioned earlier, it was only Algeria where the FLN would ultimately meet its goals. Algeria became independent, and the French minority almost completely left the country. In Ireland, Northern Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom. The Zionist terrorists in Palestine had to settle for a partition of lands between a Jewish Israel and an Arab Palestine, and in Cyprus, campaigners for reunification with Greece had to stop when Cyprus became an independent nation in 1960. Separatist campaigns have continued, such as the continuation of the IRA, but ongoing separatist movements for the Basque in Spain, Corsicans in France, and Kurds in Turkey have proven less successful. This is because the territories agitating for independence are in lands that are considered integral to their states. As such, the country's populations cannot be ambivalent about the territories in the way they may be with distant colonial holdings. Third wave, the New Left. The next wave of terrorism was the New Left, which was primarily based in developed countries, where leftist organizations viewed themselves as a vanguard for the oppressed. Representative organizations for this wave include the Weather Underground in the United States, the Red Army faction in West Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy, and the Japanese Red Army in Japan. The galvanizing factor for this movement was the Vietnam War, where the Viet Cong, a leftist and ethno-nationalist insurgency, successfully fought the United States with unconventional tactics and inferior weaponry. Following the Vietnam War, the PLO became the model organization, and it was supported by the Soviet Union and various Arab states. Tactical shifts in this wave emphasized the theatricality of attacks as organizations sought high-profile targets. Assassinations were revived as a tactic, with targets being chosen largely as a matter of personal retribution. Notable examples include the IRA killing of Lord Mountbatten in 1979 for his role overseeing the United Kingdom's colonial empire, and the 1971 assassination of Jordanian Prime Minister Safi Tal by Black September, a PLO splinter group, over the expulsion of Palestinian fighters from Jordan. Hostage takings also became a routine tactic to bring opposing governments to negotiations. As this tactic became more common, insurance companies began offering insurance for kidnappings. VEOs turned to kidnapping executives and political leaders as a means of collecting ransoms provided by insurance companies. Prominent hostage situations include Black September's capture of the Israeli Olympic team at the 1972 Munich Olympics, the kidnapping of former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro by the Red Brigade in 1979, and the Sandinistas taking all of Nicaragua's parliament hostage in 1978. Between 1968 and 1982, there were 409 international kidnapping incidents, including 950 hostages. This includes hijackings, which became common as an efficient method of securing hostages. Targets became international in nature, with a full third of terrorist attacks at this time focused on U.S. targets. State sponsorship of terrorism also grew, with the Soviet Union becoming a major sponsor of leftist organizations around the world. Other prominent state sponsors included Iran and Libya, which both faced diplomatic and military reprisals for attacks. The focus on international targets often alienated domestic supporters and foreign parties who would be potential sympathizers. Examples of this include the PLO's hijacking of US and UK planes to Jordan, which would lead to their expulsion from the country, and later, their assassination of an Israeli diplomat in the United Kingdom, which led to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. International cooperation between states once again strengthened in the 1980s as new left terrorist organizations galvanized coordinated state support against them, with countries throughout the world improving law enforcement capabilities to counter terrorist threats. Fourth wave, religious-based terrorism. Since 1979, the world's dominant VEOs have been religious in nature. This has been particularly common with the rise of Islamist VEOs, although the growth in religiously focused terrorism has been seen among most major faiths. These terrorists are motivated by their own extremist interpretations of their religion and typically receive minimal support from mainstream adherents to their respective religion. This wave began in 1979 due to two major events that took place in the Islamic world, namely the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In the Iranian Revolution, a popular pro-democracy movement to overthrow the Shah succeeded in toppling the monarchy, but radical Islamist groups led by Ayatollah Khomeini seized power in the ensuing power vacuum. In the same year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In response, a loose coalition of Sunni combatants with U.S. support organized to defeat the Soviet Union, leading to its eventual withdrawal in 1989. In both cases, religiously oriented forces toppled and replaced secular governments and contributed to the collapse of the secular superpower that was the Soviet Union. Additionally, consistent fighting in Afghanistan led many Islamist fighters to the country. The constant ebb and flow of fighters led to the development of extremist Islamist ideologies and the export of those ideologies. Many non-Islamist religious VEOs also developed in this time. Examples include the Christian identity movement in the United States, which relies on a racist interpretation of the Bible, and inspired Timothy McVeigh in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, and Aum Shinrikyo, a syncretic Japanese cult that launched a nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway in 1995. In rare cases, anti-religious VEOs have come into existence in response. The most prominent example is the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, a leftist ethno-nationalist VEO that formed to challenge the country's increasingly religious government. VEOs of the religious wave tend to be fewer in number but last longer, as they tend to have loftier goals that cannot be easily met and require long-term campaigns. The most prominent VEO of this wave is Al-Qaeda, which grew from the anti-Soviet insurgency in Afghanistan and became a major international VEO, with the goal of uniting Islam under a theocracy. The second most prominent organization, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, shares a related goal of theocratic government and grew in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011. Tactically, VEOs of this era shifted from attacks focusing on the destruction of property or limited killings to the increased targeting of civilians. One of the largest tactical shifts is the adoption of suicide bombings, which is more common in religious VEOs who can emphasize martyrdom and an afterlife. However, some contemporary secular VEOs, including the Tamil Tigers, have also adopted suicide bombing. The United States remains a major target in this wave, with Al-Qaeda's largest attacks, including the Africa Embassy bombings in 1998, the USS Cole bombing in 1999, and the September 11th attacks of 2001, all directly targeting U.S. interests. The proliferation of the internet in the 21st century has radically altered the playing field for VEOs. Many have turned to both the internet and social media to spread their ideology, promote their attacks, and most importantly, find new recruits. This wave may be continuing, with many Islamist VEOs, including one-time Al-Qaeda partners Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, remaining active in Africa. Major VEOs from this wave are still a threat, although Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been greatly weakened through international military interventions in Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2014. Corresponding with the rise in religiously motivated terrorism was the development of right-wing extremism since the 1990s. These groups developed in response to globalization, migration, and Islamist terrorism, and have explicitly anti-Muslim tenets. They've targeted migrant communities, but also government officials, including politicians, law enforcement, and militaries. While there are many far-right organizations, the most prominent attacks have been committed by lone wolves. These include the Oslo and Utøya attacks in Norway in 2011 and the Christchurch mosque shootings in 2019. Studying any model of terrorism, we must remember that it's just a framework and that VEOs have existed in some degree since the birth of modern terrorism in the mid-19th century. Shifts in tactics and ideology have mirrored and been influenced by world events, including successful and unsuccessful attacks, counter-terror actions, revolutions, and technological development. For example, scholars suggest that the new right is a new wave of terrorism. It draws from both the theatricality of the new left and the tactics of religious extremists to support its ideology. This demonstrates how terrorist phases can shift and develop while adopting successful tactics from previous generations. Chapter 5. Conclusion: The future of terrorism. While the future remains unknowable, new tactics are arising, including cyber attacks, which focus on disabling information technology systems, and environmental terrorism, which focuses on creating environmental damage. Advancements in technology will continually shape the types of tactics and strategies used. We've already seen VEOs of the past 25 years adopt new technologies, notably the internet and social media, to amplify their acts. Internationally, violent extremists and terrorists will likely form, in response to the global rise in ethno-nationalist politics seen in the past decade. These will primarily consist of VEOs that are overtly ethno-nationalist in nature, including the resurgent white supremacist militia movement in the United States and anti-Russian neo-fascist groups in Ukraine. But they'll also include a smaller number of VEOs who rise in opposition to ethno-nationalist terrorism. Authoritarianism has grown globally, along with the increase in ethno-nationalist politics, which will likely lead to anti-government VEOs throughout the world forming based on their domestic contexts. There is also the possibility for the resurgence in state-sponsored VEOs, as conflict between states has become increasingly non-conventional over time. Russia is one of the most prominent users of this tactic, as seen through its support of ethnic Russian militias and other non-conventional forces fighting in Ukraine. Iran and Saudi Arabia are also prominent sponsors of VEOs, often to thwart each other's goals, and in the case of Iran, Israel's as well. We also face a possible resurgence in left-wing VEOs, given rising global income inequality and dissatisfaction with capitalist economic systems. Movements of this type will likely focus on government and corporate targets. It's essential to monitor VEOs, both at home and abroad, that pose threats to our national and global security.